Japan's nuclear future if you screw this up. We understand all of those important interests. They're important interests. They're not vital interests, she said. And in the war over Taiwan, the interests at stake for people, for the Communist Party of China, will be vital interests because they will be about the sovereignty of China and the integrity of their current system of government. So you may threaten to escalate, she says. We will threaten to escalate, and we'll see who believes whom at the end of the day. Because our interests are vital, you will understand that you're going to back down. So the first main concept is create a fait accompli at the conventional level. The second is blackmail our allies out of joining us, staying in the conflict. This makes them the pawns in this new kind of strategic conflict. And their third main concept is that if we, despite the reluctance of our allies, choose to come regardless and to prosecute our interests, they can make it long and difficult and costly for us to do so with their, quote, anti-access area denial strategies. And they can increase the punishment on our allies. And if we really push the war to a point where they're not only losing what they tried to grab, but losing what they grabbed it with, their military, or perhaps their sovereignty is in question, as in Seoul, as in Pyongyang, well, then they can threaten nuclear attack on the American homeland, and that ought to be good enough to keep us from doing those worst-case bad things. So in a simple sense, those are the 3 or 4 main ideas that govern their thinking about how to manage conflict with us. So it's supposed to be a discussion about extended deterrence, and I framed the problem to try and explain why our allies feel right in the middle of this new game. This is not the Cold War game of mutual assured destruction. This is not a situation like in Europe in the Cold War when there were 20,000 nuclear weapons on both sides. The risk was that if a war started, all 20,000 were going to go off. That was the risk we were trying to create. So that you could never believe it could start a nuclear war because it couldn't know how it would end. Here we might have three leaders who believe they can start a nuclear war because it can be fought and won. Because we will back down, and our allies can be made to back out. The Obama administration, building on the work of the 2 prior administrations, set out a general approach for how to deal with this problem, which is to strengthen regional deterrence architectures in a comprehensive way. Now, what does that mean? First of all, it means we don't want to place all of our eggs in the nuclear basket. You know, we've discovered in these gray zone conflicts with China and the East China Sea, or with the Russians in Ukraine, that there are certain forms of aggression that they can undertake for which our nuclear threats are utterly irrelevant. It's just not credible for us to threaten to nuke Russia over Ukraine. So we don't want to put all of our eggs in the nuclear basket. We want to diversify our deterrence toolkit to increase the role for ballistic missile defense, both in the region and of the American homeland. We want to have non-nuclear means to strike at an enemy's capabilities promptly. The only way we have, if we were today to see, so North Korea has a new road mobile missile, the KN-08. And if we were to see KN-08s moving out of their storage areas to a deployment location and beginning to make warheads to the top of the delivery system, and if we were to see them beginning to fuel these missiles, the only way we have to attack those from long range quickly before they can move and go somewhere else is with a nuclear tipped missile. The threat to go first with a nuclear weapon may not be credible in that scenario. It may not deter them. It would certainly not reassure our allies that this is our only option. Again, putting all your eggs in your nuclear basket. So part of the comprehensive approach to strengthening regional deterrence architectures is introducing regional missile defense, strengthening defense of the American homeland, introducing some capability to strike promptly with non-nuclear means, increasing our resilience in cyberspace and outer space is important to managing this problem set. Putting in place the conventional capabilities that make a fait accompli look really hard. That's a part of this. So if Mr. Putin really believes he can be in 3 Baltic capitals in 66 hours, well, you know, last year they criminalized television coverage of the return of war dead from Ukraine. Russian soldiers dying in Ukraine is not politically popular in Russia. I lost that. Why did I go to that to illustrate? Why was that an illustration I was going for?
You said about 66 hours.
Thank you. 66 hours. So if we can turn that into 166 hours or 266 hours, where he has to face the prospect of dead boys coming home to television reports, is he going to be so tempted to try that fait accompli? We used to, in the Cold War, talk about the role of conventional forces. There was in Berlin a brigade of American soldiers. A brigade is a very small group. Their job was not to defend Berlin. Their job was to die. If there was ever going to be a Soviet effort to take Berlin, they were going to have to kill enough Americans to ensure that we couldn't just stand by idly. That was called the tripwire. I prefer the term of art that Jim Thomas has introduced in this discussion, which is that we need tire shredders around the Baltics. We need Mr. Putin to believe that he can't just drive in without quickly and take the thing and then say, okay, your turn, what are you going to do? He needs to understand that there is no fait accompli to be had that's low cost to Russia. So there are all these non-nuclear things to do to reinforce deterrence. These are all things we have to do with our allies. Extended deterrence used to be something we gave to our allies, we provided to our allies. In South Korea, we deployed nuclear weapons in the Cold War. We never talked to them about them. And then we took them home, and we never talked to them about that either. What did our allies contribute to extended deterrence? They were tripwires. Their job was to die. They contributed some conventional defenses too. I don't mean to underplay that. But in today's world, our Japanese allies contribute significantly to ballistic missile defense and to cyber resilience. Our South Korean allies are building an 800-kilometer non-nuclear missile because we, the United States, can't build them because we're parties to the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. And since you can't tell the difference between a nuclear missile and a conventional missile, the treaty bans both. So our allies are contributing capabilities to this regional deterrence architecture. This is especially so in Europe, where we have our NATO on our watch. NATO updated its, quote, strategic concept. This is a kind of 30 to 50-page document that the alliance issues every decade or so. It says, here's how we see the world, here's how we see our role in it, here's the function and mission of the alliance. And that was followed by a review of NATO's deterrence and defense posture. NATO has always said it will maintain an appropriate balance of nuclear and non-nuclear means. And in 2011, NATO added ballistic missile defense to the balance. So the deterrence and defense posture review looked at where do we go with this balance to ensure it's appropriate and effective. The strategic concept and the DDPR, the deterrence and defense posture review, were both before the annexation of Crimea. So NATO's having a big discussion about where to go with its deterrence and defense posture. And of course, at the middle of that is the question of NATO's nuclear deterrence posture. The United States has the triad of strategic forces, and then has always maintained some ability to deploy nuclear weapons with non-strategic delivery systems in support of our commitment to our allies. We have allies in three main regions of the world: Europe, Northeast Asia, the Middle East. In the Cold War, we deployed nuclear weapons to South Korea, not to Japan. And at the end of the Cold War, brought them all home unilaterally. We've never deployed nuclear weapons to the Middle East. We've never spoken about a nuclear umbrella to allies in the Middle East. Big question there today. What do you say to the Saudis? And in Europe, we had a significant number of nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, and the remaining number is classified, but it's 97% of the weapons that were there in 1990 were brought home. And NATO has unique sharing arrangements. The United States owns and controls the nuclear bombs that are forward deployed to NATO. But our allies, a handful of them, not all of them, buy and fly and maintain fighter bombers that are capable of delivering both conventional and nuclear weapons. And the ultimate purpose of this is to demonstrate the resolve of the alliance to stand up for its Article 5 commitment. You know, NATO's central premise is that an attack on one will be treated as an attack on all. And in the Cold War, that really wasn't that hard to prove, because everybody understood if the Soviet Union began to come through the Fulda Gap with 180 armored combat divisions, it wasn't going to stop just the other side of the Fulda Gap. Today, an Iranian nuclear attack on on Turkey, would Spain see that as an attack on itself? Hard to see that it would. So could Mr. Putin believe that an attack on the Baltics would be treated by the alliance as an attack on all? Well, he'd probably like to hope it would. And the role of these shared nuclear arrangements is to say, if it starts, if we get into a war where the questions of nuclear employment are on the table, this isn't going to be just you, Russia, and one other country, or you, Russia, and one other country in the United States. We're all in this game. And you're going to have to contend with that. That has a deterrence message to Moscow and an assurance message to the allies, particularly the Baltics and the Poles and the Czechs and the Turks, who all feel like the commitment of the rest of NATO to them is a little iffy. And that there's a wedge there that Mr. Putin could drive between them. And so these new allies are very eager for the nuclear capability of the alliance to remain in place, whereas the old allies, to use Donald Rumsfeld's unkind word, would all really rather be out of the business because it's politically unpopular, expensive, and it smells of the Cold War, which is a long time ago now. So these issues are all very currently in discussion. There's a foreign ministerial, there's a big NATO summit coming. NATO summits happen every 2 years. The summits involve the heads of state or government from the 28 allies. Every 2 years, there was one the summer after the annexation of Crimea, where the leaders of the alliance said, we got a new mess here. The premise of the strategic concept done a year earlier was that Russia wasn't an enemy. The premise of the DDPR done 6 months earlier was the deterrence measure was fine for a world in which we didn't have to worry about Russia. And they said, but let's not reopen these cans of worms right now. We just finished that work. Let's get on with the commitments we as an alliance made at that point to adapt our deterrence posture. And then 2 years from now, we'll take stock and figure out where we go next. And that's in Warsaw in July. And foreign ministers meeting next week or 2 weeks from now, the defense ministers meeting late in May, and then the presidents in July. And so all of these questions are in play. So to come back to the beginning, a handful of our allies, maybe half our allies, The United States has about 40 allies, depending on how you count them, 40 to 50. A third to a half look at the changing security environment around them and feel less secure than they have before. And they look to us, and part of their insecurity is the recognition that they're in the nuclear crosshairs, as the North Korean leader puts it. They're supposed to be the fulcrum point, the point of leverage over us. They're attackable in the eyes of those who threaten them. And they've all placed a bet that they don't need nuclear weapons of their own for this world. And that we're going to be credible and effective, not just in winning if there's a war, but preventing the war in the first place, and indeed creating a situation where we move away from this pathway toward war. And our credibility in that work is in question. It's always in question. Questions about American credibility are inherent to extended deterrence. They came clearly to the fore in the 1960s. Here we had this big security commitment to NATO, to Europe, and then for the first time, the American homeland was becoming vulnerable to Soviet attack. So the question came, was it really the case that we would trade Chicago in order to defend Berlin? Would we be decoupled from the defense of our European allies by the threat to our homeland? And that decoupling vocabulary has been rediscovered in Europe and is very much in vogue in Japan, South Korea, and certain countries in the Middle East today. So this question of our credibility can only be addressed over time. In our behavior, not just in our chest beating and what we say, but how we actually behave and the interest we take in our allies and the way we defend their interests, and by the way, defend our own interests. But it's also a function of our capabilities. And our allies wonder very deeply if on the road to Prague, in fulfillment of the president's ambition to take steps to move towards the ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons, whether the first thing we're not prepared to give up are the capabilities uniquely associated with their defense, the forward deployable non-strategic weapons. And indeed, those weapons are exactly the ones that the arms control community would most eagerly like to get out of the business. So it's a direct clash between our arms control interests and our deterrence and assurance interests. So with that, let me hope I've put enough on the table for, let me say a few words about CGSR, since you invited me to do so. CGSR is the Center for Global Security Research. Bless you. I mean, you're studying nuclear things. Most of the big thinking done about nuclear things was done a long time ago. And you should have read Schelling. I mean, there's a lot, and a lot of it's still very good. A lot of Schelling. You want to understand what North Korea is trying to do, what its strategy of conflict is, read Schelling. But in a sense, the analytic community that was interested in strategic conflict has gone away. It's gone to other problems. It went to counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. One illustration of this was the fact that in 1996, the Defense Nuclear Agency stood down, was decommissioned, and turned into something called the Defense Threat Reduction Agency at a much smaller level with a much broader mandate. And at that time, they took the entire research budget of Defense Nuclear Agency, the research budget that was spent on thinking, trying to understand deterrence and arms control strategies in the world. They took this entire research budget, combined it with the research budget of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and reduced it to $20 million. A lot. Today, the residual DTRA program in that area is $3.5 million. 1996, the unipolar world, quite benign from the perspective of the interests of the United States. Today's multipolar, complicated world, not so benign. 1/10, well, not 1/10, but roughly 1/10 of the money going to thinking. And that is sort of the state of play in the Defense Department world. So other government agencies have tried to step up a little bit, the Department of Energy in my case. And 2 years ago, Secretary of Energy Moniz said, so we're moving into this more complex, multi-dimensional, multipolar security environment. Who's doing the needed thinking about deterrence and our strategies to promote strategic stability? And who's trying to fit our allies into this? And there was no hands went up. So Livermore's hand finally went up, and this was a splendid opportunity for me to stay on the West Coast, continue to work on my sleep cycle and sense of humor. The center is trying to renew a program of work on deterrence, assurance, and strategic stability, to look at these different problem sets posed by Russia, China, and North Korea, but to look also at longer-term strategies for the United States to long-term competitive strategies and long-term cooperative strategies. We recruit pre and postdocs to come and do work in our spaces, and anybody who might be interested in doing that should let me know. We're not always timely in our reactions. And I know you all have lots of different opportunities, but we're trying to create an environment in which people can do this kind of new work and carry it forward into both the technical and the non-technical communities. So with that, we'd like to get this discussion going. You go first.
I guess my question, just to follow up on what you just said, is how do you integrate this kind of thinking about deterrence and assurance and stability with the mission of Livermore? Like, what do the scientists have to do with policy decision making at that level?
Not much directly. So Livermore is 6,300 people. 50% of them have degrees beyond the bachelor's. Of those, there are about 20 of us with degrees that aren't in the technical area. So it's obviously a very technical organization. But the policy world looks to places like Livermore for help thinking about things from a technical basis. And the work of the lab, and vice versa. The laboratory needs the inflow of policy context to understand where it can make a difference. So from a very narrow parochial interest, a nuclear weapons laboratory needs to understand what the current and future role of nuclear weapons might be. There is an old way of answering that question, which is that nuclear weapons are the ultimate form of insurance, and so long as we have them, that's what we need. That doesn't tell you how many, of what kind, where, it doesn't tell you anything about extended deterrence. So we've made, for example, a priority this year. When I started, the White House asked for help on creating a community of people who have thought about Russia's strategy for managing our escalation. So those four main ideas: fait accompli, threatening allies, etc. So we've convened a series of workshops, some in Europe, some in the United States. For each of those, we've done unclassified summaries of the discussion. We've also done lightly annotated bibliographies that align with the agendas, so that people who say, well, I sort of got this part of the problem down, but I never thought about this part, you can go just look at that part of the bibliography. So at the end of a year's work on this, we now have a story, which is about what's Russia's strategy for deterring and defeating a conventionally superior. You know the rest of the catechism by now. what's our counter? And what's the role of nuclear weapons in our counter? And this then tells us something about what we should be advocating for as a laboratory to people in Washington who are thinking about the next decisions on our nuclear project. The central nuclear question posed by Russian nuclear escalate to de-escalate strategy in Europe, the central question is, do we need a symmetric response? We thought we did it in the Cold War. Do we need one today? If you think you need one that's symmetric, well, we need all sorts of what the Russian defense minister calls nuclear scalpels. Incredibly low yield. We need every nuclear tool in our toolkit. That puts the laboratory on one path. But if the answer is no, we don't need that. We don't need to match every scalpel. We just need a few really sharp ones. That puts you on a different path. So there is a narrow parochial interest. We're answering for ourselves with our work. But but we can't answer that question without understanding the broader context. And right now, nobody else is framing that broader context. So they're soaking it up like a sponge. That help answer the question. Sir.
So I have two questions that may or may not be connected. I'm not really sure myself. So first and foremost, from the perspective of sort of the traditional commitment strategy literature, is there any more space in the current international policy arena for this tripwire mechanism that was used in Berlin and also at some point in the Czech Republic? I'm not sure. And second, when you talk about these like micro yield weapons, so I know the United States has previously adopted a strategy of sort of kind of a fire break in the yield of weapons that we produce, right? In order to sort of clearly signal what we consider warranting as well. How is the disappearance of that fire break mechanism affecting your policy making?
Well, on the second question first, and then you probably have to remind me of the first. So Russia's strategy of building ever lower yield weapons assumes that you can do away with that fire break. Do we agree? Is that logical? Is that plausible to us? That if, as a part of its escalate to de-escalate strategy, Russia starts dropping low yield nuclear weapons, and we say, gosh, that's not very dangerous. They're just low yield after all. I think the step from conventional to nuclear bombs is still a big step. They're not just slightly more destructive than a big conventional weapon. And it's not in our interest to join them down that pathway, in my view. Sure, we should have low yield weapons, and we do have some. Why? Let's take the example of North Korea. If North Korea were ever to put us in a position of having to debate employing a nuclear weapon on North Korea, if our only option were a very high yield weapon, and the wind was blowing the way it usually blows in Northeast Asia, we just result. No, it would pass right by South Korea and go over to Japan. And there'd be more radiation hazard in Japan, potentially killing more people in Japan than would die from U.S. attack on North Korea. Now, that's a lot of ifs. And does the North Korean leader really think, well, I can get away with this on the day the wind's blowing this way, but if it's blowing another way, I may probably not. That's hard for me to believe. We say we would employ nuclear weapons in the extreme circumstances when our vital interests are in jeopardy or those of an ally. If one of these characters puts our vital interests or those of an ally at risk, I don't think they're going to be too worried about the yield and downwind hazard of the weapon we might strike back at them with. So, as you can tell, I'm not an advocate for matching Russia's nuclear scalpels with nuclear scalpels of our own, largely because I don't really think that there is such a thing as a simple step to nuclear war that's not going to result in a catastrophe for all of the actors in it. And what we have to worry about is that the Russians see that differently and might calculate that we wouldn't respond to a low-yield attack with weapons of our own. That would be a big miscalculation. The first question was about more space for
More
tripwires.
less space for the tripwire mechanisms in general nuclear commitment. Nuclear or counter, I guess you would say counter value commitment strategies in the current landscape.
Okay, well, that sends me a different direction on your question. Tripwires, so it remains the case that in South Korea and Western Europe, we maintain, well, in South Korea, we maintain enough people, enough Americans and their families, to make it clear that if there were a major war on the Korean Peninsula, enough Americans would die that this would be seen by America as a major conflict and not just a grab for soul. So the tripwire is still a way of thinking about how to size the conventional force on the Korean Peninsula. This is in the debate about how big NATO's rapid reaction force should be in the Baltic states. And should it just be American? Or should it also be other nationalities in NATO? So if the problem for NATO is to demonstrate that an attack on one is an attack on all, and if what you do is compose a conventional force as a tripwire that's just one, Americans, are you getting the full tripwire benefit? Probably not. So there's a debate in NATO about how multinational the force needs to be. But I'm not sure I've answered your question because the second half went in a different direction, so come back.
So basically, I guess the core of it, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but I've been thinking about the tripwire as just a counter value commitment strategy. Frankly, right? That's the goal of it as a mechanism, or at least it's the way that I would come down.
So how do you define the counter value strategy?
Commitment strategy. So once you attack the forces, we as an agent, the United States as an agent, is obligated to act, right? There is no more autonomy of decision making. We are now forced to attack you, right? So it's a form of a commitment strategy. And I assume it would be counter value because I can't imagine how we would fight and exclusively counterforce conflicts with Russia when they're invading the Baltic states.
I've always found this language of counter value and counter force a little too clarifying because the choices aren't really that way. There's no, as you observe, there's no way to have an all counter force strategy when Saddam Hussein puts his biological weapons in an apartment building, there's no way you can strike his biological weapons without killing civilians. And I use that as an illustration because it's a universal approach now. If you want to go after Russian command and control bunkers, you got to go through apartment buildings on top of them. So is there a tidy counterforce versus counter value strategy? No, and the United States has never really had it either. And just to be clear, we don't have a strategy for fighting nuclear war. What we have is options that the president can execute if he chooses to employ, he or she chooses to employ a nuclear weapon or many nuclear weapons. But the strategy is crafted in the circumstance. What is it that the particular conflict presents us with in the way of something we want to stop? What is the extreme circumstance that they've created? What's at jeopardy? And what are the things that we can do to get them to stop? And we'd rather that they stop short of doing everything that might be within their means to do. Taking everything away from them they might have, they made harder and harder and harder by going underground or mobile. So the counter value strategy of the 1960s doesn't fit today's world. I'm sorry, counter force. And counter value, the Chinese have a strategy for deterring us. It's called dropping 24 megaton weapons on American cities. We accepted the rule of international law in 1997, the conclusions of the International Court of Justice. And so we accepted them as binding on our nuclear deterrence strategy. That means we're obliged in our nuclear targeting to try to discriminate and to try to be proportionate. Discriminate civilian from military and be proportionate in terms of the damage you're avoiding by the damage you're doing. So our strategy has not fallen in a tidy way in counter force versus counter value. But in the case of large standing conventional forces, you put your finger on their main function, yes. Who's next?
I want to follow up on the question of credibility. You talked a little bit about how reasonably the U.S. credibility is ultimately in question and you demonstrate it somehow. But it's also backed up by both like promises and possibly some assurance of capabilities, right? So are there ways of demonstrating credibility without actually having a hot conflict? Are there concrete ways that one can demonstrate that level of credibility?
The short answer would be no. The longer answer is that our credibility is, to exaggerate, being tested every day somewhere in the world. One of the things that's interesting for me, I'm one of the very few, the community of people that thinks about extended deterrence in America is not big. But to the extent it exists, it has people who look at one region or another. And I've had the benefit of being involved in both Northeast Asia and Europe on this topic. And one thing I've learned is how much they look at the experience of the other. And particularly more so from Northeast Asia looking at Europe. So if you're Japanese and you're worried about how America is going to deal with China's rise, how America deals with Mr. Putin is a lead indicator. If you're worried about, if you're South Korean and you're worried about America's willingness and ability to bring nuclear weapons to your defense when North Korea really gets out of control sometime, you watch like a hawk whether America is serious about keeping nuclear weapons in Europe or not. So I think we tend to forget that in a multipolar, complex security environment, you're always playing to multiple audiences. One of the things we had to learn to do with the Nuclear Posture Review and Ballistic Missile Defense Review was when we finished, we never finished the draft. When we got to a draft at a certain point, we did emulation teams. We created groups of 10 people who could pretend to think like Russians, 10 who could pretend to think like Chinese and North Koreans, and allies and bystanders. What do you make of this? What would they make of this? And this is America's problem in the 21st century. One of them. You're playing to such a diverse audience looking for so many different messages. And on credibility, we are always falling short in somebody's eyes. Because our commitments are so numerous and the challenges are so numerous. And a lot of people look at our failure, they look at so Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nukes. Look what happened to him. Ukraine gave up its nukes, Budapest Memorandum, what's that? And our allies are the first to say, but they weren't allies. This doesn't raise a question of American credibility. This is why we are American allies. Because we understand that there's a difference between just being another country that gets a promise out of Washington and actually being an ally where America has put its signature on a piece of paper and says, your vital interests are our vital interests. And so I, as a former government official in the second Obama term, have watched a lot of people trash the credibility of the Obama administration. At the same time that I've gone around and made the rounds of capitals in Europe and Northeast Asia and heard words of great confidence about the credibility of the United States. So, I'm not sure whether that means me or not. Check your question. Sorry.
Yes, like, going back to nuclear posture review, and I think you briefly touched on this in here. Well, could you elaborate on the challenges posed when thinking about extended deterrence in the 21st century landscape, where you've got the threat of potentially non-state actors, as well as acquiring such nuclear material?
Well, we didn't worry about non-state actors as a focus of extended deterrence. I mean, what your question hints at is the problem of the difficulty of having a nuclear strategy that's about all of these different problems. The first nuclear posture review, 1994, was done by this many people, all of them in uniform. They had one simple question: what do we do with all this Cold War nuclear stuff now that the Cold War's over and the Soviet Union's gone? 8 years later, the George W. Bush administration said, well, our nuclear strategy is it's about more than that. It's not just about deterrence and the force balance, but it's our arms control strategy and our strategies for assuring our allies and dissuading competitors. And then we came along with the nudge of the Congress and saying, no, your nuclear strategy needs to do all of those different things. And the reading of the Obama administration, following the advice of the bipartisan congressional commission, was that although the threat of nuclear war has gone down since the end of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear attack has gone up. And that threat of nuclear attack comes from non-state actors who might seek these capabilities, or we didn't use the word rogue state, but regional challengers, who might think that they could blackmail us with 1 or 2 nuclear shots. And we argue that our first priority of the 5 was to strengthen nuclear counterterrorism and nuclear non-proliferation. And these are inherently problems that the United States can't deal with alone. You can't counter nuclear terrorism if it were to happen with a nuclear weapon loaded into a container ship that would go off in the Oakland port. Counterterrorism starts way back before it's put on a truck, shipped to some port in China, loaded into a container, then brought in. Nuclear counterterrorism needs to be done internationally. Nuclear nonproliferation needs to be done internationally. And if you want the support of countries who don't otherwise have much of a stake, our reading was our nuclear deterrence policies needed to be a little more closely aligned with our disarmament commitment. The George W. Bush administration didn't have much to say about the disarmament commitment, and it didn't find much cooperation from other states on countering nuclear terrorism and countering nuclear proliferation. We've gotten a little more. Did we get a lot for what we tried to do? Not so much. Does that get to your question?
Yeah, so I think just follow up from that as well. When you are trying to collaborate with these kind of allies, I think last week with the Nuclear Security Summit, that was a perfect encapsulation of some of these challenges. Like, to a certain extent, we're going to have this kind of summit, but have somebody like Vladimir Putin decide not to show up. How do you address this kind of challenges? Is it possible? Like, are there ways to kind of think about cooperation at that level and think about these kinds of threats?
Well, you have to begin by articulating interests in a way that engage the interests of others. And to the extent we describe our national interests as singular, we reduce the likelihood of cooperation. Who was it who famously said, in order to lead, others have to want to follow? And to lead on nuclear counterterrorism, you have to have strategies that others see as consistent with their interests. Who else wants to come into the conversation before I go back to?
So sort of to discuss the effectiveness of extended deterrence nowadays versus during the Cold War, and its relationship with what you tangibly have to back it up. I know during the Cold War, there was a significant emphasis on intelligence, and we didn't know exactly how many weapons the Soviets had, and they didn't know exactly what we had, what our capabilities were. To what extent is that still true today when we have so many more ways that we're not sure about that information can be compromised? I mean, in light of all of the cybersecurity threats that exist in all sectors, how much of our deterrence strategy is dependent on the security of information?
That's a very good question. It depends on how much you believe Ken Waltz. So have you read Walt Sagan? No. How many of you have read the Walt Sagan debate? So, boy, that's a sign of the time. Meaning, everybody who was starting to study in this business read the Walt Sagan debate for about 20 years. Waltz was at the University of Southern California or UCLA?
He was at Berkeley. He was here once. He was at Berkeley.
That explains so much.
Yeah,
He in 1979 published a short paper entitled Nuclear Proliferation, More May Be Better. And his argument was, look, who would have thought in the 1940s and 50s, you had this great big standoff at the end of World War II. Everybody thought the Soviets were going to try and make a grab. And look, by the end of the 1970s, we were well into détente. And what happened? Nuclear weapons have pacified a conflictual relationship. And he argued further, all this crap about you have to signal clearly and communicate clearly in private back channels and all this. Nuclear weapons have an utterly clarifying effect. You don't need to say anything for people to understand they could just better not start on the pathway that gets you down there. And then across the bay, was Sagan across the bay then? I don't think so.
It was at Harvard.
Scott Sagan, studying organizational theory, said, what are you, nuts? It might work for big modern powers, but the guys who are getting nukes aren't exactly the people you want to have running around with nukes. The organizations want reliable. Look, even the United States and the Soviet Union had all these accidents. Imagine Pakistan or Argentina or Brazil. So they then produced a little book that had the 2 essays. And then 10 years later, they each wrote commentaries. So there were 4 essays and then reissued. And then 10 years later, again, each as the world changed, trying to redefend the ideas they started with. It was a very interesting exercise, the Waltz Sagan debate. But the Waltz view that nuclear weapons just have an utterly clarifying effect. But I've lost the core of your question. I circled away around.
To what extent is the security of information still central to the concerns?
So Waltz's answer is not very. And I don't think Kim Jong-un believes that there's any significant gap in our knowledge about his deterrent capability. He's tried to shout about it loudly enough and show it repeatedly. Are there secrets that they have? Definitely. How many, where, how close are they to having missile deliverable warheads? But has he communicated enough for his deterrence message to be credible in our eyes? I think he would say yes. I think there are, in addition to secrets, there are mysteries. We would like to know what are the conditions under which he would actually employ nuclear weapons. He may not know the answer to that question. Is the information we have about North Korea reliable? I don't think it's much cyber corrupted. Is the information we have about Russia's nuclear capabilities passing through some filter of cyber manipulation? Probably. There are probably things that we see that don't exist and other things that we don't see that do exist. For our deterrence strategy to be effective, we need to communicate our capabilities, our resolve. We need to demonstrate that resolve in addition to just communicating them. So I'm not sure that deterrence is all that much harmed by the fact that we live in a much less reliable or perceived reliable
So,
information environment.
as you said that multiple entities have a sort of a stake in making the concept believable that they can instigate a conflict without a credible response. That they want like Russia with its smaller weapons wants to show or wants to make it believable that they could use some low yield weapon without the United States being able to, or without us responding with large weapons. If the United States position is more clear that, nuclear will be met with nuclear, it seems like the burden of information is less on the number of weapons and more on what will trigger each actor.
About which research can't tell us anything. And spying can't tell us anything. What you're saying is it's scenario dependent.
And different for different entities. Whereas, that's it. It exacerbates the difficulty with which a multipolar conflict is worse than a bipolar conflict.
Well, let me be clear, first of all. These three actors, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, I don't think any of them want to go to war with a conventionally superior nuclear armed major power and its allies. They're not planning for aggression. No, they all have what they call active defense strategies, which look a little aggressive to their neighbors because they're about changing the status quo. But their preferred course of action is not to have war with America. Their preferred course of action is to, in the North Korean language, break our hostile ways, break our hostile policies. In Vladimir Putin's language, it's to remake the European security order in a manner more consistent with Russia's interests. And in Xi Jinping's formulation, it's America retreats while China rises. That's what they want. They don't really, I believe, think that they're going to have to fight or win a nuclear war against the United States. I think, so I've in the book, I use the word theory, the term theory of victory. Theory of victory it's of course an old familiar term. It had a particular Cold War connotation. In the Cold War, Harold Brown famously said, "We build, they build, we stop, they build." Why? Why were they building? Were they just building because they were building, because that's what they did? They cranked them out like sausages? Or did they actually think that they could fight and win a nuclear war? Or that they could fight and win a major conventional war in Europe that wouldn't go nuclear because of the nuclear presence? Did they really think they could win, and what would that mean? And if they have a theory of victory, should we have one? And this was a debate that began in 1978 or so, and really never got settled, and then the Cold War went away. Well, these three characters have theories of victory in the spirit of Clausewitz. So if your view of war is a continuation of politics by other means, then victory is not when you vanquish your enemy on the battlefield. Victory is when your enemy comes to a political point that says, I'm not willing to run these risks and pay these costs anymore. I capitulate. I will accept your terms for peace. But that's their fallback theory of victory. Their main theory of victory is in the spirit of Sun Tzu. I want you to capitulate without fighting. And so I don't want you to think that I'm a nuclear warmonger. And I don't want you to think that the only metric of success of our nuclear strategy is that it deters nuclear war. It has to also provide for our Sun Tzu theory of victory. We want them to understand that, we want Putin to understand that he's not going to be able to break NATO, that we're not going to back down, that democracies aren't weak, feckless, easily dividable things, and that he's going to have to accommodate our interests too. And I could make similar arguments about Xi Jinping and
It was Lenin who had said, quantity is a quality bowls over. It's sort of endemic to Russian culture. I mean, half the stuff may not work, but if enough stuff, we'll be scared out of their minds.
And it's Trotsky who said, you may not be interested in this war, but this war is interested in you. And there's a little bit of that quality to this particular problem. This has not been a problem in which most American experts in the defense community has been interested in, but unfortunately it's been interested in us. One more or two more? We haven't heard from you, so.
My question is that while we keep saying that the Cold War is over, but the fact remains that the US and the present day Russia continue to be, opposed to each other, and Europe seems to be the theater of war or the battlefield. And the conventional, theaters of war remain, as you mentioned yourselves. So just like low yield weapons, what if all these three countries decide to use low yield actions to, achieve the same result? Do you think it will still lead to a nuclear kind of usage of nuclear weapons? Because the idea fundamentally of nuclear weapons is deterrence. But if they are able to achieve this, and the war that we think that war will always be conventional, and nuclear weapons are required to ensure that that conventional war can be stopped by the very fact of existence of nuclear armory. So do you think if any of these actors, without the usage of nuclear weapons, tries to achieve the same objective, how will the nuclear deterrence theory or that come into play then? See, because Russia did attack Ukraine and Crimea, but I mean, so if it decides to attack the Baltic nations in a conventional kind of a war situation, and
If it jeopardizes the vital interest of the U.S. ally, we have said that leaves us in a position where we might use nuclear weapons.
Remember, they'd be attacking NATO members if they attack the Baltic states.
So attacking Ukraine conventionally doesn't matter. I mean, that's not a test of our nuclear commitment to an ally. So I'm not quite sure that I see. So we don't see nuclear weapons as credible deterrents of all forms of aggression, all forms of war. They have a very limited utility, but it's an important one. It's in deterring aggression against the vital interests of the United States or an ally. It's not about deterring all forms of aggression. It's not about deterring all forms of conflict. It's not about gray zone conflicts. It's not about Ukraine, because that's not an ally. It's about a very narrow range of things. And so the old argument that nuclear deterrence was about preventing all conflict, well, that sort of fit the Cold War, but that's not the world we're in today. And why? And to go back to your first question, aren't we still, in a sense, in the Cold War? In a sense, we've returned to a Cold War-like thing. But this is different. The relationship with Russia is different. There is no Iron Curtain. We have a lot of shared interests, especially the Europeans with the Russians. There is no fold the gap with 190 armored combat divisions lined up to go through to the Atlantic. I mean, that was huge. military fact. There is no plausible pathway to major all-out nuclear war, which there might have been in the Cold War. You could debate that. And moreover, for much of the Cold War, we thought the Soviet Union was a rising power. And today, it's clearly a declining power. So I think there are some similarities in terms of the potential for military conflict between the West and Russia, but a very different overall context. Somebody else wanted to come in over here.
I have just one other follow-up question. You had a fabulously succinct proposal for what North Korea, China, and Russia's strategy against the United States is in terms of the strategy to deter and against potential superior nuclear power and its allies. What is the United States?
That's a great question.
It's under construction.
This was actually an interesting point of writing a book as a former government official. When you know that both enemies and allies will read what you have to say, what do you say in this regard? And I chose to tell the truth, but not in great elaboration, which is, so if there's a red theory of victory, a common theory of our potential adversaries, what's the blue theory of victory? Does one exist?
Sorry, what's red in this context?
Red is the bad guys. When you do war games, red is a substitute for mentioning countries by name. And the good guys in our war games are blue. When you go to China, it's the reverse. Good guys are red and bad guys are blue. Yes. So, what's the blue theory of victory? Is your question in a way. And what I say is the truth is that there is one. That we have worked in the Department of Defense and in the U.S. military community generally really since the wake-up call with Saddam Hussein. When he was first threatening the use of missiles and WMD in the 1990s. The Department of Defense has been working on this problem. But unlike in the Cold War, every premise was examined by the intellectual community, every assumption tested and challenged, and there's none of that going on today. The core idea is, the core idea, I like the Chinese term when they describe their nuclear strategy, counter-deterrence. It's not a deterrence strategy, it's a counter-deterrence strategy. And why do they call it that? Well, I say, okay, deterrence, that's your American word for coming over here, grabbing us by the throat, and preventing us from doing what we think is right and necessary in the circumstance. Our objective is not to deter you. Our objective is to counter your deterrence of us. And how do we do that? We're going to strip away your confidence in your ability to dominate escalation. You say, you Americans say you can manage the risk of escalation by being able to outcompete any adversary. If they choose to fight at this level of violence, we can go here. So we Chinese, we just go here. 24 megaton bombs against your cities. You decide. It'll be automatic. You cross the nuclear threshold, you drop a nuclear weapon on us. We'll shoot these 24 megaton weapons at your cities until you stop. So how much do we Chinese actually have to worry about your nuclear threats? Well, not much. I'd love to make Mr. Putin's nuclear threats go away, but that's not going to happen until he goes away. So what should we be aiming for? We should be aiming for putting ourselves in a place where we, like the Chinese, can just ignore these threats. Where we can just say, hey, Mr. Putin, you're wasting your time and energy because we don't think you could ever make good on this threat. It would be so much to your disadvantage to do this. And we're just not going to let a conflict unfold in that way. If you miscalculate, you'll pay a terrible price. So the core of the idea is about countering their strategies in in a way that strips away their confidence in their ability to manage escalation. And I see missile defense as playing a critical role in this. Because if their strategies are basically blackmail, brinksmanship, coercion, and if they have to show a little nuclear leg in order to show your credibility in your strategy. What does it mean to show a little nuclear leg? Well, that's Russia's escalate to de-escalate strategy. That you use a few nuclear weapons and say, you don't stop now, I got 10,000 more. And if we can, with missile defense, take away the threat of a few, so that if he wants to blackmail us, he has to fire not 1 or 2 or 3 or 5, but 50 or 100. Well, 50 or 100, that's starting a big nuclear war. And for that, nuclear deterrence is critical. So I see missile defense playing a role.
Dr. Roberts, we're on your deck to discuss the tool that the deterrence makes.
My pleasure. Thank you all for watching. Thank you.
We'll take a break till 5 off.
You wanted to ask one more question?
I did, but I'll. So my question to you is, we spent a little money on civil defense from a foreign We've got to be done with comprehensive system reports.
Yeah. I just have some time. I'd like to get I can at least finish problem. It's maybe there. I finished it. Yeah, I think we could do your plus.
Is the legacy in civil defense.
2, maybe.
So I grew up
3, we might.
a decade after
What's the Semi-auto?
push on civil
What?
defense.
Semi-auto one?
And I did duck and cover drills. I grew up in Vancouver. And the ramp, one of the ramp facilities
Never.
located right
Might
next to
try
the
to get
elementary school I went to.
That's enough.
Okay, I went to.
Are you guys on this?
All right.
I should have done the same on that, but I didn't know the case was.
Stove cover tomorrow is still potential.
Well, so,
These have gone through reflectors.
my elementary school was right where the road, where one ramps up to.
I don't think, no.
You come up from the column, you go.
We haven't.
Well, that was the junior high school,
That
which
has
is
to
further
be.
out of Zoom.
I think, yeah,
There was an
that's,
elementary school.
it was the,
And
Yeah.
there's the Malibu church up there.
I mean, it's all of election 19.
Yeah, that was a random nuclear research center. And so it was a target of Soviet nuclear attack. So we had to do duck and cover drills that were down the highway, down the road, and then in the storm drain under one. And the school had civil defense
my friend
stuff.
thinking,
Water in tins that was about a decade
from
old.
here
And crackers that were,
Your friend. Oh, she is from San Diego.
the whole civil
for-
defense
for
thing
other
came to look like.
Well, it was a rush.
So, but I think the legacy of being Christ-like has gotten in the way for the generation of people like me who had, that was the impression that was formed. We're sort of now the decision makers about being invested
I
in this.
hope the Giants Dodgers aren't that way.
The barrier to
That's on the
full civil defense, if you give it a new name,
Are the Giants away?
remediation,
Yeah, they're playing for
economic recovery plan,
I bought tickets for
those
the
things.
Saturday game,
Okay.
Giants Dodgers.
Because I saw actually, I think in your talk, you were referencing.
I would know which
about
one was over.
Possible, a model.
membership.
I don't have a problem with people,
Somewhere that's in the same.
but I
Thank you.
sure.
Like, so I don't feel like I can.
Nice.
We do some work on, we do both. There are people who are all policy and little technical and the reverse. Mostly, well, we have pre and post acts. We're pretty thin on that issue. More interested. People come in, so like Anthony Juarez, you know, I mean, he's in the center 3 days a week, and he's helping me on all this work on Russia, understanding Russia's strategy and what we should do. So there's relatively little technical work that he's done. We've got somebody else coming in part-time on these treaty verification issues, and looks a lot at the technology of treaty verification. So,
Technology of treaty verification. Okay.
so one of the hot topics in treaty verification is why can't these help me? Couldn't there be an app that can help me to know what's happening in North Korea?
Who's gonna make the app?
Well, so Thursday, all day at Stanford is a conference on that topic.
Oh,
That
really?
CSAC has helped co-organize. And
Wow.
there are 3 firms in the Bay Area that have expressed a commitment to use startup funds to do
Really?
something in this area.
Would anybody trust that? You know, the technology.
Well, you know, so there was a Defense Science Board study on treaty verification 4 years ago, and you can read the unclassified summary online. And their basic argument was, in the 20th century for the intelligence community, treaty verification was the big deal, and monitoring the world was the little deal. And in the 21st century, it's the reverse. You still have some treaty verification things, but there's so much going on, there's so many different actors, there's so many sensitive technologies, so many potential weapons programs. What you need is to be much better about this monitoring as opposed to this verification thing. Can social media and new technologies help with this? Probably. And does it matter that they're really high grade and fully reliable? No. When you're just trying to assemble the pieces of the picture.
But I mean, if there's so many people that can have iPhones to monitor your camera and things like that, I mean, would anybody allow a cell phone that has that kind of capability to be next to a sensitive nuclear weapon?
It happens all the time in the United States, that people take their cell phones to places they shouldn't take them.
Okay.
What about the other possible formulation of this polymer subset of situations in which it is in both parties' interest to have treaty verification? Right, for that subset, a narrow slice of pizza, then
Then you would have,
sensitive,
oh yeah,
right? Because it would be just as easy for someone to falsely accuse you of breaking the treaty, and you have the data, like you're out of people's pocket all of a sudden. But maybe there are some situations in which you
so you, oh yeah. 5 minutes.
I wanted to ask your opinion on the trajectory of U.S.-Russian relations. Where do you think it's going? Awful thought.
Well, I think it's going to be bad so long as Putin remains. And the problem isn't just Mr. Putin, it's Putinism. It's a whole way that Russia's become made to work. So when he goes, is he going to leave the door open to something completely different afterwards? I don't think so. And I think it's in his heart that Russia got screwed.
Yeah.
And that to make the world a better and safer place, he needs to counterbalance American power, not break the European order. So I think the trajectory is not good. I see no signs of his reforming in some way. The latest message is that, of course, we should be getting back to business together on the things where we have common interests. That's not a new message. That's all along, ever since they were sanctioned, they said they need to get back to business as usual. And they hunger for every hint that might happen. No, I think, I work a lot on missile defense, and I was working for Dr. Nacht. I was one of the point people on trying to provide strategic reassurances to Moscow on missile defense. And from a technical point of view, there is nothing that our missile defense can do about a Russian missile.
Good. What is the limiting factor?
Well, with the, so, depends on whether you're talking about missile defense in Europe or the American Homeland. Missile defense in Europe, 98% of trajectories by which Russia might ever launch missiles at the United States are nowhere within range of those European missiles. Then in addition, the radars, they think the radars can look everywhere. The radars are discriminating against radars, they look one place. But so, and I go to a lot of unofficial dialogues with Russians and Chinese and others. We were having again a discussion with Russian experts about missile defense in Europe and the credibility of the threat to Russia. And this guy was the former national security advisor to Yeltsin. This was about a year ago. And he said, look, just stop. Stop talking about the probability of the PK, the probability to kill, the interceptor speed, the number of interceptors, the range to the trajectories. That there used to be a great many people in Moscow who thought about these things and whose opinions mattered. Now there's only many people think about it, but they're not permitted to have an opinion. And there's only one person whose ideas matter. And he said, let me explain to you how this guy thinks. Think of the difference between a dog and a tiger. Well, he said, if you throw something at a dog, he catches it. If you throw something at a tiger, the tiger watches you, doesn't watch the object. Even if it hits you, even if it hits the tiger doesn't react. Focused on the difference. What's the other difference between a dog and a tiger? He said, if you're coming up to a dog's property, but you're on the other side of the fence, the dog pays you no attention. If you cross into the dog's territory on the other side of the fence, then you've got the dog's attention. The tiger watches anything coming close, and if it's going away, they stop watching. He said, now I told you everything you need to know about Mr. Putin's views of ballistic missile defense. You Americans are in the wrong strategic vocabulary.
So we're thinking about the dog, we're thinking about the tiger.
Right. And so we try and conduct a dialogue in our strategic vocabulary of reassurance and assurance and deterrence and the like, and he's just in a different place. And so is there a possibility of a rapprochement? I don't see one.
I'm sorry, what was this? I really missed it on the tiger. What does the tiger do?
Two differences between a dog and a tiger. A dog, if you're approaching the dog's territory, I'm sorry, I had to let's see. Well, okay, if you're approaching the dog's territory, it's fenced off. The dog doesn't pay any attention to you until you're at the fence or inside the fence. Then the dog's engaged. The tiger, the fence is irrelevant. If you're approaching, you're in potential danger. And the other point he made was if you throw something at a dog, what does the dog do? Catches it, sees it as an opportunity for play. A tiger will not take the eye off the thrower to watch the object. The object may hit the tiger will not react. The tiger's focused on the danger.
Is the Russian talking about Putin?
This was Yeltsin's national security advisor talking about Putin and explaining how thinking about missile defense in Moscow has changed. He said, I've now told you everything you need to know about Mr. Putin's, about Russia's everything it thinks now is thought by one person, and this is how he thinks about missile defense. So we have a cottage industry of people who still try and come up with ideas for how to, when Moscow is ready, to resume a dialogue of some kind, how we can build some confidence in this area. And this man's argument would be you're utterly wasting your time. And if he's going to be president until
At least 2020, maybe beyond, 2024.
2024, so 10 more years, you'll all be 10 years into your careers.
Really,
On that really happy note, I'll let you all go back to business. Thank you all. Nice to meet you. My pleasure.
Be in touch on monthly. Thank you.
The news report.
Well, I hope you found that useful in mind stretching. We went into the book. Okay, it's my copy. So I was one of the reviewers. So, okay, well, Dr. Ops actually has touched on a number of issues related to what we're going to discuss, but I want to give you a slightly different perspective. A lot of the course is on the policy side, like U.S. policy. But this little presentation is more just a survey of the plausible danger areas for nuclear proliferation without reference to U.S. policy. Just if you are on Mars and what would you see? So here's a version of what you might see on Mars. One is, again, just from the nuclear weapons perspective. This list here on the left, on the far left, are the 5 declared nuclear weapon states. That's been true since 1964 when China detonated. And their position has been, at least officially, we have them, no one else should have them, the world will be a safe place if we have them. They're not going to give them up. But we don't want anybody else to have them. Although, by signing and ratifying the NPT, there is a nominal commitment to eventual nuclear disarmament without any specifics. So U.S., Russia, China, UK, and France, 5 declared nuclear weapon states. Then over the years, from the late 50s well up to the 70s when India detonated, and then to the late 90s when they declared, you have 3 other states, Israel, India, and Pakistan. Israel has this unique posture of not declaring that it is a nuclear weapon state and not declaring that it isn't. It's not a member, it's not a party to the NPT. And I think I mentioned in the past, one former Prime Minister, Golda Meir, once said, we will not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East, nor will we be the second country. I'm sort of puzzled on what that means exactly, but the consensus among the nuclear weapons studies community is that Israel has at least 100 deliverable nuclear weapons from aircraft and from missiles, and now they're building ballistic missile submarines. And then you've got India and Pakistan that both officially detonated and declared in May 1998 that they're nuclear weapon states. They never signed the NPT, they're not parties to it, they're not in violation of it because they never joined it. And finally, you have this other TUSA, North Korea, which was a member of the NPT, declared it was a non-nuclear state, and then violated multiple agreements, both enriched uranium and reprocessed plutonium, and has now detonated 4 different times, and has declared itself a nuclear weapon state and has withdrawn from the NPT. So they're the only one in that category. And Iran, moving closer to a nuclear weapons capability that's now been, based on in terms of the agreement which you're studying, stopped for at least 10 to 15 years. And while this was under activities, but not surrendered, it's highly enriched uranium, it's not reprocessing, it's not enriching, and it's not going to have weapons for 10 to 15 years as long as that agreement holds. So that's kind of just a snapshot of the current nominal state of play of nuclear weapons states. Any questions or issues about that? Yeah.
So, quick question regarding Israel. That seems to be a very unusual strategy posture. Do you have any background on how they came to that conclusion and why they've adopted specifically that posture?
Oh yeah, no, there's a good literature on it. There's a very good book by Abner Cohen at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, which is the Monterey Institute. Abner, A-B-N-E-R, Cohen, C-O-G-N, which is the most authoritative account of how they developed the bomb, and also on the doctrine. And basically, they don't want to be seen as an outlaw. They don't want to be seen as a pariah state, although they are a pariah state in many parts, many countries. They wanted to have it as a basically kind of silent deterrent against they thought would be a massive conventional attack by multiple Arab states. That was the original intent. They had been attacked by multiple Arab states multiple times. They had the bomb before the Palestinian conflict really matured, and well before the Iranians moved rapidly toward nuclear weapons. I'll get into their relationship with other states when I move into the next category. So that's sort of an abbreviated version. Now, Bracken says we're now in the second nuclear age. And what he means by that, of course, is that we're way beyond this US-Russia binary nuclear deterrent dance of death, so to speak. And now we're into problems of regional nuclear proliferation. So to repeat in Wade Brad's term, maybe we're going to have less probability, lower probability of a thermonuclear war and nuclear annihilation, but we may be a world of increased likelihood of nuclear weapon use. It's conjecture, though, of course. Fortunately, we have no data. Let's hope we never have data. But the sentiment is growing in the studies community that this may be the world we're moving into. So I presented here, I know you can't read it very well, so I'll translate. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different dimensions to this second nuclear age. Not all of which Bracken discusses in detail, but I want to hopscotch through all of them quickly. And on the last one, we'll get to that in more detail when we read Allison's book, which is the next assigned reading after this in the nuclear policy side of the course. They're not in any particular priority order. They're just 6 somewhat separable regional nuclear security issues that now are front and center. Beyond, of course, the kind of latent US-Russia condition that is still there. I mean, it hasn't disappeared, but it's just thought of as not in any way comparable to the global struggle between Soviet communism and the United States during the Cold War. So the first one I cite is Iran, because Iran is not a done deal in everybody's mind. The agreement was virulently criticized by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey, by Egypt, and by Israel for different reasons, all saying that because the Ayatollah can't be trusted, that the agreement won't be adhered to, that there may be ways that they can cheat that won't be detected. We'll hear more about this from George Moore next week, because the devil's in the technical details. But there are a couple of extra dimensions to this problem. One is that Iran is a Shia Persian state. It's not Sunni and it's not Arab. And you see now the incredible toxicity of the Shia-Sunni conflict throughout the Arab world. It's taking place with enormous vengeance in Syria, in Iran, in Iraq, pieces of it in Turkey, and so forth. So the Saudis, for example, even when I was in government and I left in 2010, that's 5 years before the Iran agreement was signed, they said openly to senior American officials, including myself personally, that if Iran was on the brink of or acquiring nuclear weapons, developing nuclear weapons, that it was 100% certain that Saudi Arabia would acquire them, and the implication was probably buy them from the Pakistanis. Because one thing to note is Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, although very different, are Sunni states. They're not all Arab states. Pakistan's not an Arab state, Turkey's not an Arab state, but they're all Sunni states. And you have also with Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, who really, I think, envisions himself as a great Sunni Muslim leader, resurrecting something, the Ottoman Empire, or some other version. He's got his own version of a caliphate of sorts that he'd like to see resurrected, with Turkey in the lead. And by the way, Turkey, unlike Egypt and even unlike Pakistan, has a very active, capable technological base. There are many really high-class universities, research institutes, think tanks, very knowledgeable about nuclear materials. They recently bought a nuclear reactor from the Japanese. But yet Turkey is a NATO member. So question number one is, what can be done to ensure that Iran abides by the agreements so that further proliferation doesn't materialize in the neighborhood, so to speak, by either Turkey or Egypt with the cooperation of Pakistan, which, remember, is not an NPT party, so they are not prohibited from supplying nuclear weapons because they're not in any agreement that prohibits supply. So that's one dimension of the Iran problem. The other dimension of the Iran problem is just the bilateral problem with Israel. Iranian leaders, starting more explicitly with Ahmadinejad, who's the former president, and then more recently by the Ayatollah Khamenei, have called for the destruction of Israel multiple times in multiple fora. And Israel, of course, takes this seriously. So there's been a long debate in Israel, at least for 6 years, maybe longer, about whether Israel should preempt and physically attack Iranian facilities. Now, much of that is highly classified by the Israelis, and people don't have access to it. But not long ago, there was a published account of an interview with Ehud Barak. Barak was the defense minister when Netanyahu was the prime minister, going back to 2009 and 10. And Barak, who was Labour, but then joined in the coalition government, Barak who himself was an advocate for military strike against Iranian facilities, again, this is before the agreement with the U.S., said that Netanyahu approved conventional strikes, not nuclear strikes, Israeli conventional strikes against key Iranian nuclear facilities like the Natanz, key reactors and enrichment facilities, and so forth. And that twice Netanyahu was told that either the Israeli Air Force couldn't carry it out, they didn't have the, remember it's 1,000 miles from Israel to these targets. They've never done anything like this in their history. They've had preemptive strikes against this Iraqi reactor in 1981, against a Syrian reactor provided by North Korea in 2007 or 8. They've never, this is not a sortie, this is an air campaign with hundreds of sorties, going through a very sophisticated missile and air defense that Iran has developed, courtesy of Russia. But we know that, so Netanyahu was told that they didn't have the capability or that the probability of the high confidence in destruction of the facilities was not great because so many of them were deeply buried underground and only a nuclear weapon could destroy them. This caused a huge stir in Israel, and there's actually some people who want to bring charges against Barak for revealing state secrets. I actually don't know where that stands now. It died down a little bit. Then we also know, of course, that Netanyahu was told Obama many times he was totally opposed to the agreement. He did the unprecedented step of coming to the United States, speaking before a joint session of Congress, opposing the nuclear agreement that the president was negotiating. And he did it in consultation with the Republicans without any consultation with the Democrats. He was also active, Netanyahu was active in support of Romney in the 2012 presidential campaign against Obama. So an intrusion of a foreign leader on U.S. domestic election politics, unprecedented. So I would say, someone who is fairly familiar with this set of issues, this is the most poisonous relationship between two heads of state, between the U.S. and Israel, since Israel has been founded in 1948. It's the absolute worst it's ever been. But, life goes on, at least presumably it's going on. But it does raise this question, depending on what Iran does or doesn't do as we move forward with the implementation of the agreement, will Israel take military action unilaterally against Iran? We know that Israel was involved in some way in collaborative action with the U.S. in the cyber attacks against the Iranian centrifuges. So this is not just whistling in the dark, hypothetical, make up mumbo jumbo. This is real stuff. So either the proliferation by other Muslim states, Sunni, or the Israeli military action are possible consequences of the Iranian program, assuming they don't adhere to the agreement. If they adhere to the agreement, presumably, these threats will dissipate. That's the first one. Any questions or comments on that? Yes?
Here's the question. There's no formal agreement between the U.S. and Israel.
No, Israel is not a security ally of the United States by treaty. There's no official agreement. As Brad said, we've never made any formal security guarantees to any state in the region, even though we have various agreements with them. We've been supplying Egypt financial aid and military aid for 35 years since the Camp David agreements. We supply a lot of weapons and financial aid to the Israelis. When I was in the Pentagon, Israeli, very, very senior Israeli military in the Pentagon every day. There's close intelligence share, there's all kinds of, but at the political level, it's a very dysfunctional situation. Yes.
So can you comment a little bit on the way that Saudi's foreign policy towards Israel plays into this situation? Because I know that their saber rattling and their actual defensive policy are a little bit different.
Saudi policy toward Israel?
Yes.
So that's a somewhat separate, complicated story, and nothing simple. You know, I'll just do a brief, it's a larger subject, which I don't think I can get into if I can get through all six. I'll just say it a short version, which is as much my own as it is based upon more detailed analysis. Unquestionably, the top priority of the Saudi regime is to stay the Saudi regime. That's unquestionably the top priority. And they feel very much beleaguered by many things, the collapse of the oil market, by Iranian infiltration into Shia communities in eastern Saudi Arabia. The Saudis might just as well like to see the Israelis do the dirty work for them. Let the Israelis destroy an Iranian capability so that, because the Saudis can't do it themselves. The Saudis basically buy people and rent people to do things. They're not too good at doing things. They're very good at paying people to do things.
What's the asymmetric strategy for that?
Sorry?
The Saudi and the Iranian relationship is an asymmetrical strategy.
The Saudi and Iranian relationship is, without shots being fired, it's total war. It's total war. They are the chief regional rivals for power in the Middle East. Deep Sunni Shia hatred. There's nothing that they have in common. So it's the enemy of my enemy, my friend, a little bit. If the Israelis, who of course the Saudis have no interest in seeing continuing to exist for religious reasons. If the Israelis are the enemy of Iran, then an enemy of Iran could be a friend of Saudi Arabia. I'm going to stop it there, otherwise we won't. It's a large. So that's what that first means. Iran and Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Turkey. I didn't get a chance to talk much about Egypt because Egypt is going through its own problems and what's happened with Morsi and the rise of the generals and all that. They do not have great technical capability to build their own weapons. They have to have a lot of support. And that's where the Pakistanis might come into play. There's also a separate question, by the way. Pakistan is the only Islamic state with a bomb. That's worth a lot. Do they want to share it with another Islamic state? Not so obvious. Not so obvious. So I don't in any way to imply a kind of billiard ball effect or automaticity to this proliferation. I'm just saying these are the players in that conflict. The second over in Northeast Asia is North Korea. So North Korea now has 4 detonations. They have asserted, which all U.S. technical experts have refuted, that they detonate a thermonuclear weapon. There's no evidence of that. But they're detonating 5, 6, 7 kiloton weapons. And more importantly, in a way, are they moving toward miniaturization and getting them on warheads for missiles? Kim Jong-un was originally thought to be maybe a more enlightened leader than his father and grandfather, because he studied in Switzerland and all that. Turns out to be more bizarre and crazy than either of them. It's been sort of confirmed that Kim Jong-un has only been in power 2.5 years. He's 31 years old. He's executed at least 70 of his top aides, 70, including his uncle, his father's brother, and the defense minister. So this gets South Korea and Japan, understandably, very nervous. And now you're going to have this bizarre comment by a Republican presidential candidate about North Korea and South Korea and Japan should have their own nuclear weapons. It's never been uttered. So Trump said it last week. It has never been uttered by a single American presidential candidate in U.S. history. No one has ever said that, what he said last week. And fortunately, I mean, the Prime Minister, Japanese Prime Minister Abe, or immediately refuted that we're not interested. Whether they are or not, it doesn't matter. He said. So then he's reassuring us. But it's a festering issue. Clearly, United States policy to denuclearize North Korea has failed. North Korea has an arsenal of weapons of uncertain number. They have them buried deep underground. They have mobile delivery vehicles. And there's a question, how long will all the stuff Brad was talking about, the credibility of U.S. security guarantees for South Korea and Japan be credible? It's been credible for about 50, 60 years, but nothing is forever. And some claim that the Obama, unwillingness to use major force, used a lot of small force like drones, but major force, the unwillingness to use boots on the ground is undermining the credibility. So that is the second one. There is also a subsidiary issue, even though it's a North Korea issue with Taiwan, because it's possible that if South Korea or Japan is seen as moving to acquire their own weapons, that this would be evidence to Taiwan that the American security guarantees are not credible in Tokyo or Seoul, and that might be good enough for Taipei to say, well, we better have some too. And this isn't just some simple puppet-like thinking, because in the 70s, both Taiwan and South Korea started nuclear weapons programs. And the Ford administration sent senior emissaries to both Taipei and Seoul and told them that if the programs were not immediately stopped, in the South Korean case, we tear up the security treaty. And in the Taiwan case, this nebulous issue where we would provide arms, we wouldn't quite say we defend them, or we would say we wouldn't defend them, we would just walk away from them. And both of them stopped. But that's now 40 years ago. So Taiwan is more of a big player in that scenario, but it's not absent in that. That's the second region. Yes, sir.
I had a question about North Korea. Could you comment on the technical abilities in North Korea? Because I don't think they developed their own nuclear system.
No. North Korea has extensive reprocessing and enrichment capabilities to produce weapons-grade material. And we know they've detonated 4 devices. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what is known about their ability to put them on warheads. But they actually have quite a capable, small technical community. They were mostly, all of them trained in Russia. The top scientists were trained in Russia. More recently, it's possible the Chinese helped them to some degree, although the Chinese claim that's in '64 when they became a member, since 1970 when they became a member of the 52, whatever they did with them, but they haven't provided any. The other thing to know about, though, is there are Iranian North Korean connections. It's cross-regional. You can't only think in, compartmented regional terms. Pakistan, which we're going to get to next, Pakistan, with A.Q. Khan, provided technical support to North Korea and to Iran. So I think the North Koreans have been very entrepreneurial in getting support from multiple sources to strengthen their program. Third, which for quite a while the U.S. felt was the greatest probability of nuclear weapon use, but I think that judgment is receding somewhat, is the India-Pakistan issue. Now there you have, the fact that the two states were created in 1947, and deep rivalry, unresolved territorial disputes in Kashmir and elsewhere, a Hindu-dominant society with a huge Muslim population versus a Muslim population. Pakistan plays a complicated role in Afghanistan, festering problems there, which gives them an opportunity to use it as a buffer against India. Let me tell you one of the scenarios that's been of great concern in Washington for a number of years. You may recall 2008, I think, was the Mumbai attack. And many innocent civilians were killed. There were like 17 or 18 teenagers, or many in their young 20s, who went in there. They were orchestrated by Pakistani control. I think I may have mentioned this. Did I mention this? That about the Fareed Zakaria program. Fareed Zakaria has a program, I forget the title, it's something. No, GPS is not a weekly program. He did an HBO special with something like Terror in Mumbai. I'm sure you can get it on a computer right now. It's a terrific program. Fareed Zakaria was born in India. He was originally Muslim. He gained access to the Indian intelligence intercepts of the Pakistani controller instructing the terrorists in Mumbai what to do. And you could hear it right on the program. And in the course of that program, the Pakistani controller says to these young kids, remember what you're there to do. You are there to kill as many women and children as possible, as quickly as possible, and then to be killed yourself. That's why you were there. And they carried it out. They killed a lot of women and children. They all got killed except one. And I think that one has now been executed. Is that right? Yeah. He was executed. So the scenario of concern, and there are variations on this theme, is that, and of course India exercising extraordinary, almost superhuman restraint, did not respond to this. Right? They were attacked, no response, no military response. So the scenario of concern is that there's another attack, another city, some other version of this, lots of innocent people killed, a sort of Paris-like, just mass slaughter. Especially with the current prime minister, no hesitation that they're going to respond. And they used Indian conventional forces in small numbers into Pakistani territory to get at the source of this attack. There are variations on all this, but I'm just giving you the Cliff Notes version. Then Pakistan, because they've lost several wars to India in conventional arms, uses its substantial array of tactical short-range nuclear weapons on Pakistani territory to kill the Indian forces that have invaded Pakistan. And then India responds with a major nuclear attack on Pakistan. I mean, the catastrophe would be beyond belief. Pakistan has acquired and deployed a large number of short-range tactical nuclear weapons since 1998. So that's a big concern. Others say this is just dreaming by Americans not to worry. Brinkmanship, but they'll never fight each other. The nuclear deterrent is going to keep them from doing that. There is a question I put on the side, China. China is an ally of Pakistan, has provided nuclear help in the past, tends to be a rival of India. Not clear what China would do. So that's a third scenario. By the way, I didn't mention, but I won't go into detail, on the second scenario, a somewhat separate concern is that North Korea itself would implode and the status of its nuclear arsenal would be at risk. And the question is, who controls it? Who tries to control it? What's done with it? It's a whole other story. That's 3 down, 3 to go. Europe. So Europe is viewed, I think, as, at the moment, not so much of a proliferation problem, not so much of a regional nuclear problem, but there is this one central issue, and Michael May discussed that briefly last time, and let me just articulate it again simply, because he didn't give background. So, you know, what do we know? We know that Putin's basically been in power since 2000. At one point, he had to step down because the Constitution said he couldn't be prime minister. He couldn't be president, so he became prime minister. When I started in the Obama administration, he was then prime minister, and Medvedev was president. Now Medvedev is prime minister, and Putin is president. But Putin's basically been the architect of national security policy since 2000. And we know that he's been deeply wounded by what he feels as American policy in particular that has brought NATO right to the edge of Russia, that has marginalized Russia in world affairs. There's a lot more to that. But anyway. There's a fantastic speech, by the way, if you want to read it. It's on the web. Putin made a speech right about when they went to Crimea. It's around March 14th or 16th, 2014. Read that speech. It tells you a lot about what Putin's thinking. Now, what's alarmed the nuclear community in the U.S. is that the Russian military has developed doctrine, and they've been training in exercises, and they've been building weapons, all that are consistent with this term escalate and de-escalate, in which instead of the traditional American view about nuclear weapons that deter attack, that the Russians would, I mean, I personally think it's so risky, it's a bit almost bizarre, but you know, crazy things happen. That Putin would invade the Baltic states and use, with conventional forces, but use at a very early, even in the first day or two, some small yield nuclear weapons on largely, you know, military targets, ports, or whatever. I'm not trying to kill a lot of people, but you know, nuclear weapons. And basically say, don't mess with us. It's a fait accompli. We're done. We've taken the Baltics. NATO, US, stay out. So that's the term escalate to de-escalate. And this has gotten a lot of attention in Washington because it was not a strategy that we had been playing against. So the question is, what do we do about that? Because this is less a matter of proliferation as it is a matter of early nuclear weapon use in a regional situation. And Brad talked about that. I wrote down Baltics, Poland. I mean, it's I guess, conceivable if only